Capitalism is a very, very different, in many ways, form of class society than previous class societies. Most previous class societies, or all previous class societies, were characterized by the exploitation of the mass of the population, but nearly all the surplus, nearly all the wealth taken from the mass of the population was wasted, was used in unproductive methods. It was used either to maintain a fantastic high living standard for the ruling class, or it was used for conspicuous consumption, building of cities, temples, and so on and so forth, or it was used on warfare. Under capitalism, though all these other features persist, what is central about capitalism is because of the system in which rival controllers of the means of production are in competition with each other, they are forced to, by this competition, to use much of the surplus, much of the wealth they take from the rest of the population, and use it to invest it in advancing the means of production. So capitalism is characterized by a dynamic of economic growth unparalleled previously in history. But this all raises the question of why and how this system came about. There's very, very crude answers you find. You find, for instance, they ran a series of programs on television, I think 3 or 4 years ago, on the rise of modern society. I don't think you called the term the rise of capitalism. There's a book by a man called David Landes, which again deals, I think it's called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, which tried to explain why capitalism and economic growth took part in some parts of the world, not in others. And essentially, all of these come down to explanations in terms of peculiarities of Western culture. Landes, for instance, really argues there's something special about parts of Western Europe going back to the time of Socrates and Plato, which means that certain moral values, certain ways, certain values, certain ideas predominate in Western Europe and make capitalism possible without being possible elsewhere. Similar ideas are found again and again. Really what I want to argue is there is a Marxist understanding of capitalism which rests upon a very, very different foundation. And here I want to argue essentially that far from there being something peculiar Western about capitalism, the elements leading towards the development of capitalism are to be found in many parts of the world. It's a fact of history that these elements broke through in, not in Western Europe as a whole, in some parts of Western Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries, and didn't manage to break through by then elsewhere in the world. But I want to argue the elements are to be found in many parts of the world. First, I think we have to say that this central fact was not grasped, was not understood by much of the discussions in 20th century Marxism, or late 20th century Marxism, over the question of the origins of capitalism. There's 2 major debates took place in English. One debate took place in the late 1940s, early 1950s, in Britain, mainly in Britain, among economists and economic historians associated in the most general sense with the Communist Party. People like Morris Dobb, Sweezy, Hilton, and various other people. A debate called The Transition from Feudalism to Capitalism, a very interesting debate to read. A second debate took place in the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s, by various economists associated with what was then called the New Left. I suppose today we'd have to call it the Old Left, of which the most important was an American revolutionary Marxist, Bob Brenner, who wrote a book, and he wrote an article on the origins of capitalism. It was criticised by another economic historian, Emanuel Wallenstein, and then after that emerged a whole debate which is called the Brenner debate. These arguments, the arguments they're concerned with, are essentially about the relative roles played in the development of capitalism in the West, between the role of the market and the role of class struggle in the countryside. And what the debate is essentially about, however, is not the development of capitalism on a world scale. It's about really why capitalism developed in Western Europe, not in Eastern Europe, or even more narrowly in the case of Brenner, why it developed in England and not in France. I want to argue that in both sides of that debate missed 2 central things which are absolutely characterise Marx's own understanding of capitalism, which we can take up and develop today. The first is what they ignored, and partly this is lack of understanding of economic history beyond their own particular narrow province, is that if you look at the development of, for Marx's interpretation of capitalism, what is central is not just the relations between people, the way in which the relations between people in production grow out of the actual organisation of production. For Marx, the history of humanity is a history of in part, of the growing control which human beings have over nature, the growing capacity of people to increase, to advance the means of making a livelihood, what Marx calls the forces of production. If you do not understand the way in which there's advanced through history of forces of production, you cannot understand why capitalism and capitalist relations emerge at a certain point in history. Unfortunately, in both sides of the debates, the transition from feudalism to capitalism debate and the Brenner debate, the question of the development of the forces of production is virtually ignored. In its extreme form in some of Brenner's writings, and the writings of a Canadian Marxist, Ellen Wood, in which they deny there was any development of the forces of production in the feudal period, and therefore claim you cannot explain the rise of capitalism due to this. The second element, which is missing, in my view, is missing from most of the contributions to the debate, is something else central to Marx, who argues that the changes in the forces of production give rise to changes in the relationship between people, and this gives rise to huge contradictions in society, often described as a clash between the development of the base to the superstructure. It's a metaphor which Marx uses, but what he wants to say is this reaches a point at which great revolutionary convulsions, not small-scale little class struggles, great revolutionary convulsions which express themselves in economic forms, in ideological forms, and in political forms, and it's how what the solution to these convulsions is, that is, how the class struggle breaks through, not in some narrow economistic sense, but in terms of great ideological and political upheavals, which determines how society advances. I'll try and spell out some of these things in the next few minutes. The first thing I think we have to be clear is that when we talk about capitalism, we're not just talking about markets, or we're not just talking about people making money through trade or lending or making loans. In a certain sense, there's forms of capitalism in a very, very wide sense, going right back to the very, very origins of class society. In the sense that there's all sorts of societies in which you find merchants. Merchants are people who make money by getting goods one place, selling them somewhere else, and in the process marking up the price which they charge. There's a usurer capitalism. Money lending capitalism exists where you have impoverished people, often impoverished peasants, who need to borrow money in order to survive through to the next harvest, and in return for borrowing the money are prepared to pay 20, 30, 40, 50, 100% rates of interest on the money they borrow. Both these forms of making profits exist historically very, very long time back. And exist in a whole range of different societies. You find merchants exist in the earliest class societies, in Sumer and Babylon, in ancient Mesopotamia, in Greece and Rome, in ancient China and India, in the Abbasid Islamic Empire of the 8th and 9th century AD, in the Inca Empire in Peru, in the Aztec Empire in pre-Columbian Mexico. But this itself, merchant capitalism and usurer capitalism, are not the same as the capitalism Marx meant. Because merchant capitalism, historically, meant you had a ruling class which made its money out of exploiting the peasantry. The peasants were forced to hand over their surplus to the ruling class. The ruling class then wanted certain luxury goods it couldn't get other ways, and the ruling class was prepared to pay over the top to merchants to get them the goods. For instance, a crude example, in ancient Babylon, ancient Sumer, there was an area without wood. The merchants needed wood, the ruling class wanted wood to build houses, they wanted luxury goods, precious stones and so forth, certain sorts of metals. Merchants, class emerged, who provided these things by travelling very long distances at great risk to themselves To get these, the upper classes handed some of the wealth they got from exploiting the peasantry over to the merchants. The merchants were part of the process, part of the groups that exploited the rest of society, but they did not do so independently. They were dependent upon the old landed class. When we talk about productive capitalism, or modern capitalism, we mean something else. We mean a system in which the capitalist class itself is directly involved in exploitation, in which a new way of exploiting develops, in which the capitalist class itself directly exploits people. It takes control of the process of production. It doesn't take things indirectly from some other group which exploits the mass of the population. It exploits things directly themselves. And essentially, if you want to analyse what we mean by productive capitalism, it involves a fundamental change in the way in which exploitation takes place. In pre-capitalist societies, exploitation, as I said, takes place overwhelmingly through a group which control the land, forcing people who want to work on the land, people taking off the wealth directly from the people who work on the land, who work the land, usually from peasants, occasionally in some societies from slaves. When you talk about capitalism, you talk about the wealth. The capitalists get control of the wealth because they control means of production, and they don't own the people who live on the means of production. They don't own slaves. They don't have people who work on the land for their own, just work on the land, and then the capitalists just come along and seize the wealth from them. Essentially, it's a system in which, as Marx put it, the immediate producers, the people who do the labour, are free in a double sense. First, they're free in the negative sense. They're broken away. They have no control over the means of production. They're not like the medieval peasant who was on the land and had some degree of control of the land, and then the feudal lord came along and took the wealth away from him. They're not like the medieval slave who himself was owned and therefore tied to the productive apparatus by coercion. Under capitalism, the immediate producers are free in this sense from the means of production. They're free in another sense. They're not tied to any particular capitalist. They can hawk the one thing they have to sell, which is their ability to work, from one capitalist to another. They don't control the means of production. All they control is their own wealth. They can sell that wealth. So they control their own labour, and they can sell that labour in order to get a livelihood to whoever they want. And this creates a whole new dynamic of production, because it means that the capitalist controls the means of producing wealth, has the appearance of not immediately dominating people, and yet in people seem free, the worker seems equal to the capitalist, and yet the whole system means the capitalist, because he controls the means of production, or she controls the means of production, can force people to work and to produce more in their labour than is necessary to keep them alive. And it all takes place under the appearance of no direct coercion and no direct domination. And once the system comes into being, it has an enormous capacity, because the surplus is taken from the immediate producers, with the immediate producers being subject to the apparent immediate coercion. The surplus goes to the capitalist, who can then invest it in. Because he or she controls the means of production, they get a surplus every day that someone works for them. They get a bigger surplus. They can invest in more means of production, and their control of the means of production goes greater and greater and greater. And the separation of the massive population of the means of production, if anything, gets worse, because the massive population depend ever more upon their ability to sell their labour in order to make a livelihood for themselves. Now, when does this new form of production take place? What's interesting, for it to begin to take place, it can't take place at any point in history, because what the ruling classes are interested in is getting a surplus. If they can get a surplus just by owning people as slaves, they will take a surplus by owning people as slaves. If they can get a big surplus by just allowing the peasantry to work the land, and then going along and grabbing, effectively seizing the crops off the peasantry each year, and tie this all up with various
pretenses, it's always an ancient thing which is always done, it's a normal thing to happen, and so on and so forth, they will do it. You do not find the development of capitalist production taking place before a certain point in history. And this point is determined, and this is why I want to come back to the question of development of the forces of production. But the whole point, up to a certain point in history, for any ruling class, it's more, the easiest way to get the surplus is direct subjection of the mass of the population. But at a certain point in history, developments of the forces of production, in the means of creating a livelihood, reach a point where it becomes more and more dependent upon the initiative and involvement of the immediate producer. Under crude forms of agriculture, directly seizing the crop off the peasantry every year, or seizing half the crop, is quite effective as a way, if you're a ruling class, of maintaining maintain your exploitation. In the period of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and certainly the earlier period of ancient Rome, ancient Rome, late Republican Rome, it was very, very beneficial to the ruling class in ruling over southern Italy. You import captives of war, you use them as slaves on the estate, you physically own them, you force them to work for you. They're captives of war, which means at that period there's an endless supply of captives, so you don't have to worry about them having children or bringing up families. You can just directly exploit them, and you can get a massive amount of their labour is translated into a grain which you siege yourself and you control. But at a certain point in history, the development of force of production begin to create a situation where it becomes more beneficial for an exploiting class, or a certain section of the exploiting class, to move to the question of free labour. When does this take place? It takes place effectively when the forces of production reach a certain point, and now the phrase Marx used was the roundaboutness of production, which I think is very confusing, because when we talk about roundaboutness, it seems to relate to road islands or to carousels in a fun fair. What Marx meant at a certain point in which past production leads to tools, equipment, fertilizers, development of animal husbandry, and so on and so forth, that you have a very, very high level of inputs into production, and out of that very high level of inputs, you get a massive output. At that stage, it becomes quite important. You have a labour force who are prepared to commit themselves to production, show some interest in production, and so forth. And it's at this point that you then begin to have the possibility of the capitalist method of production begin to dominate. Now, what's interesting, and this is where you have to challenge the idea that capitalism only showed the elements of capitalism began to develop only in Europe. You find this process begin to take place right across what's sometimes called the Old World, the conjoined continents of Europe, Asia and Africa, from the 8th, 9th, 10th century AD. And it doesn't start in Europe. If you want to look where the first signs of this sort of capitalism develop, you probably find them in Song China. That's China in the 8th, 9th, 10th century AD, when you find the first signs of some people emerging who control production not through slavery or not through coercion over the peasantry, but by elements of free labour. It's here you have whole massive developments of force of production, or the use of cast iron, the use of the first use of the compasses in sailing, the use of the advanced use of fertilizers, development of printing, development of paper, a whole range of technological advances which create a qualitative step forward in the ability of human beings to make a livelihood. And with this qualitative step forward, you have the first possibility of a form of exploitation different to the old forms of exploitation based on direct coercion. If you follow the story through, you find that by the 14th or 15th century, there are elements of this developing over a whole range of parts of the world. You know, there's a sort of European capitalist myth that all the rest of the world was impoverished and poor until the British and French colonialists, or British, French and Dutch colonialists captured them. If you actually look at the world of the 14th, 15th and 16th century, you find whole areas which is essentially a very, very similar level of development. Again, China probably in the vanguard, parts of the Middle East, the parts of North Africa. There's a very, very interesting history by a Moor from southern Spain who journeyed all round North Africa and then returned to Italy in the early 16th century. Description of societies very, very advanced indeed, with many of the things we'd identify with the advances occurring in some small parts of Western Europe at the time. You find the same things down the port cities of East Africa. You find some things on the Malabar coast of India, in Bengal, and so forth. The idea that there was some sort of peculiar Western development, actually if you look at the development of the means of human beings making a livelihood, until the 15th or 16th century, you find this process taking place. Not everywhere in the world uniformly, but in certain places across the world. Certain, usually ports with a hinterland around them, and where these developments are connected. Of course, we're talking then of also a period of history in which movement by sea was much more efficient than movement by land, and by sea, maritime communication brought very distant parts connected together. And this applies to parts of all of what's called the Old World. Not the New World, of course, until 1492, the Americas were completely cut off, or more or less completely cut off from the rest of the world, and Australia was still more or less completely cut off from the rest of the world. But you talk about the other continents, you talk about these developments taking place. And so, for instance, if you look even at development of production in China, productive techniques, certainly until the mid-15th century, China was more advanced in terms of its production than the Western Europe, or any part of Western Europe. It's an interesting fact that I think in 1420 or 1430, a Chinese fleet sailed from China, sailed all the way to the east coast of Africa, and if it had wanted to, could have sailed around the Cape and sailed up to Europe. It didn't. I mean, there's two explanations why it didn't. One is that the Chinese emperor didn't like these expeditions, which is probably true. And another reason is there was very little up the west coast of Africa or in Europe that the Chinese, with their advanced economy, actually needed in terms of trade and so forth at that important time. But, so this is deep. This leaves to open a question, however, because what is true, having described it, and I think it's quite important to understand, because it destroys all the myths that somehow Aryans were superior to the rest of the population, or Nordics were superior to the rest of the world's population, or that some particular group was responsible for the advance of humanity. What is true, however, at some point, something happens in Europe which enables the breakthrough to take place. Or let's put it the other way, something happens elsewhere in the world which means that having developed up to a certain point, then Europe is overtaken, which is some way better to say. If you were around in the 10th century, if by some freak someone from China had bothered to come to the barbaric bits of Europe, they would have been amazed by the backwardness, the primitiveness and so forth of European society. Even if you're around in 1400, if you come from China to Europe, you might have been impressed by the cathedrals, but overall you would have thought that Chinese society was more advanced. If you came in the 17th century, there was much more the sense that Europe had caught up with the other parts of the world. And if you had come at the end of the 18th century, it became clear that Europe somehow was overtaking the rest of the world. And there's long debates about when exactly, particularly related to China and Europe, or China and Western Europe, when the change took place. There's long academic debates about whether it took place in the 16th century or the late 18th century. What is clear is at some point Europe did overtake, or parts of Europe. And here I think we have to understand that here's where you have to combine with the notion that development of capitalism was not just development of class struggle, that played a role. It certainly wasn't just development that someone was having the right ideas. It was partly a product of development which took place on a worldwide scale of forces of production, and those forces of production created the possibility of a new way of exploitation, and this new manner of exploitation had a dynamic which old forms of exploitation hadn't. here you have to throw in the second thing, which is central in Marxist accounts, for instance, the Communist Manifesto or the preface to the Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy, a rather long-winded title to his book. What I think you have to understand here is what Marx stresses is in any society, advance doesn't just depend upon the development of force of production, themselves creating the possibility of new forms of organising production and therefore new forms of exploitation, new forms of extracting a surplus. It also depends upon the clash between what Marx called the superstructure and what he called the base. By the superstructure he means that in any class society a whole series of mechanisms develop by which the ruling class protects its rule. Centrally, he means a state. The state is there to enable the ruling class to control the rest of the population, enable the ruling class in one country to grab wealth from the ruling class in another country. Alongside the state, there develops various ideological mechanisms which back up the control of the ruling class. Essentially, religious mechanisms of one form or another, usually embodied in hierarchical religious institutions and so forth. And you can throw in all sorts of other elements which add to this superstructure. The superstructure has a role at a certain point in history of cementing the rule of a certain ruling class, of naming the form of the exploitation it's associated with to dominate and to take off and maintain control, but at certain points then prevents any emergence of other groups. Now, if you look at the event of capitalism, what's interesting is outside Europe, I'll begin outside Europe, you find countries in which the force of production have the capacity to advance, and then you find the superstructure is so powerful that it stops it happening. The classic case, for instance, is China. In the development of the force of production in China in the first millennium, there's a whole period of Chinese history called the Tang dynasty, in which the Chinese emperors physically worked to stop the people in the towns organising in any way whatsoever in opposition to the regime. They actually divided the towns up. The towns were divided by internal walls, and at night there were guards to stop people going from one part of the town to another. What was involved was a conscious attempt to prevent the merchants, the petty traders, the petty people involved in petty handicrafts in the towns developing any independence from the Chinese empire. You find this does not stop development of production taking place in China and of new forms of organisation. By the Sung period, the 9th and 10th century, you have the breakdown of the internal policing mechanisms in the towns. You have some forms of what look like embryonic capitalist agriculture taking place in the countryside. You have landowners leasing out land to people who employ waged labour to produce the crops, and so on and so forth. But you still have other fantastically powerful mechanisms. For instance, you have an examination system which effectively keeps control of the state under people who are capable of doing the long, very long, laborious process of passing examinations in old way and have to accept old ideological things in order to carry it through. This doesn't dominate completely. If you read, there are clashes over the organisation examination system. There are books which begin to emerge, and China had printed books unlike Europe, in which people begin to talk about how to organise production in ways we would see as sort of proto-capitalist ways. What is interesting though is the new force of production do not break through. Because they don't break through, the weight of the superstructure at a certain point paralyses society. The Sung Empire is conquered, divides in half, and then is conquered by people from outside the Sung Empire. You have the potentiality begins there, and it's broken by the inability of the new class to organise, really to overthrow the old form of society. And you could apply the same thing some 500 or 600 years later when you talk to Ming Empire in China. You have even more advances in means production, even more developments of certainly elements of merchant capitalism. You have clashes between the state and merchants who want to expand the trade from the southeast China, and you have the state you have challenges to the ideology, but you have the state basically maintain its control, and capitalism does not break through in China. You can find a a picture not quite the same, but some of the same elements if you look at the development in the Indian subcontinent. Because again, despite the mythology, the development of technology in the Indian subcontinent, certainly till the 16th or 17th century, was the same level of development as in Europe. And people, I read books people describe today the technology of somewhere like Afghan villages as being medieval, and then you see they had water wheels, mills, sophisticated equipment, and so all this is late medieval equipment. It's not barbaric equipment, it's not time-old equipment, this is due to spinning wheels and things like this, which may seem to us fairly primitive. These are all technology of the 14th, 15th, 16th century. If you go to Jaipur in northern India, which was part of one of the princely states, you find there's can't remember what you call it, where you do astronomy with observatory, an open-air observatory, using the most sophisticated techniques to try and plot the movements of the stars. These are not primitive societies. Or if you go right through to the building of the Taj Mahal was built with the most advanced technology available in the time across the whole of Eurasia and Africa. And we know that because it used craftsmen from right across China, France, Germany, etc. were paid to go there to build it alongside local Indian architects and so on and so forth to build it. The technology was more or less the same level. What you also find is the advance in production. Again, it shakes people when they discover this. Is actually India was the world's biggest exporter of cloth until about 1730, 1740, probably later than that. The Indian cities were full of vibrant handicraft people working away, particularly producing cloth, etc., producing technology. And yet India didn't break through to capitalism. And again, there is an explanation. The explanation has to be that India was the contradictions. You had established a political superstructure twice, which was imposed first under the Delhi Sultanate from about the 13th century onwards across a whole chunk of North India, and then with the Mughal conquests in the 1520s, which a political superstructure which imposed on top of a society where the local controls of land exploited the peasantry, exploitation by the state, and sucked resources from the countryside into the towns, without resources then flowing back from the towns into the countryside. It wasn't an epochal thing. It lasted for essentially, in each case, for 150, 200 years, but it's sufficient for a certain period in time to stop the developments of production taking place. It began to break down in the 18th century. From 1690 onwards, it broke down in terms of breakdown of the Mughal Empire, broke down into civil wars, peasant uprisings and so forth. And you can look and you can say its potentiality was there. With the breakdown of the Mughal Empire, with the superstructure sucking out the wealth of society, at that point there would have been the potentiality for the beginnings of capitalism. Potentiality was not realised, not because there's something weird and peculiar about India, but because the British East India Company superimposed itself on that for a period, attracted the elements looking towards developing capitalism in India to itself, and then smashed the development of the forces of production in India for 100 years or more. This process, you cannot understand the interaction between the development of the forces of production, creating new means of exploitation, and then clashing with the political superstructure. And it's not something peculiarly English, it's not something peculiarly European, it's not something peculiarly worldwide. If you look in Europe, you can see the same clashes. The most advanced area in Europe, probably the two most advanced areas in Europe in the 14th and 15th century were northern Italy and the Low Country, the Flemish areas, Flanders. Now, in neither area did the forces of production break through to create capitalism. And you have to say it's not just a question of whether these countries were intrinsically backward or the ideology or so forth. Essentially it's a question that the old organisation, the old political superstructure imposed itself. In northern Italy, I think the final death blow came with the French invasion, which was, I'm sure Chris Banbury would tell me, I think 1500 thereabouts. 1494, actually 1494, the year after Columbus sailed, yes, I should be able to remember that. The French invasion, which actually meant a smashing, tearing apart, or huge waste, and pushed the rulers of the northern into Italian cities, or created a situation in which the northern Italian cities became dominated by people who wanted to go back to the old rule for exploiting the countryside and not developing the force of production. In the case of Europe, one of the most advanced areas in Europe at the end of the 15th century was the area which we now call the Czech Republic, Bohemia and Moravia. They were all sorts of elements pointing towards the development of capitalism in those countries. They were controlled, they were under nominal control of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire became a whole centre of forces wanting to stop any challenge to the old order of society. You have a long, bitter war, the 30 Years' War, as a result of which the whole of Central Europe is pushed back in terms of its development by, 50, 100, 150 years. It's the clash between the new mode of production and the old political superstructure creates these enormous tensions. And here, this is why, I'll end by saying, this is why I think it's important to understand this. It has two implications. One is an implication not, I think, all that important, but I do think it means much of the argument in the English literature about journalism from feudalism to capitalism cuts away from all the most important elements. It cuts away, ignores the forces, the forces of production, and it ignores the ethical confrontations, by which I mean capitalism could not have broken through in Europe, in any part of Europe, without a combination of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the French Revolution. You cannot talk about that whole period just in abstract about economic change, or about class struggle in the countryside, or about markets. You have to talk about how these elements come together. Has a second consequence, which I think relates to us today, that when we talk about the challenges to capitalism, we also say the challenges to capitalism themselves depend not just upon the blind operations of markets or forces of production and so forth. If the bourgeoisie couldn't conquer power crudely without a huge ideological transformation from the Renaissance through to the Enlightenment, through to the huge upsurge in learning and thought and so forth of the French Revolution, you can't talk about a working class breaking through without learning in the same ways. At the end of the day, it's not just force of production and so forth, it's human beings taking on and challenging all the old assumptions which are absolutely essential. On the question of interest, I think it's quite important to understand interest is only one form of exploitation. I pay God knows how much every week to the Northern Rock Building Society, and that is a form of exploitation of my labour. I work, they take it. But most other people in this room work for various companies. You go and work for them. You think you're free. They make you work 8 hours a day. They basically make you into a slave for 8 or 9 hours a day. And somehow, making you into a slave for 8 or 9 hours a day, at the end of that time, they don't lend you anything. You usually lend them a week's work in advance before you get paid. At the end of it, they make huge profits. They make the profits through the exploitation of your labour, not just through interest-free payments. I think it's quite important. There's three forms of exploitation, if you like. There's you buy things here and you sell them more expensively somewhere else. That's what merchant capitalists do. And that's existed for as long as class society, for 4,000 or 5,000 years. There's lending people money who are desperate for money, and then you charge them more for getting it back. That's usury capitalism. That existed also for 4,000 or 5,000 years. And there's modern, I'd call it productive capitalism, or free market capitalism, I don't want to call it, in which apparently no one is exploited, no one loses anything. I do a fair day's work, and I get a fair day's pay, except somehow the fair day's pay always results in the employer making a profit for which he has done nothing. And that is what the system we're talking about. And we're really talking about where does this come from. And I should say here, let's talk about the origins of capitalism. Some of the last speakers talked about the development of the banking structures being essential to Western capitalism. Banking structures exist in a very sophisticated way in Abbasid Islam. There's all sorts of ways, if you're clever, you can make interest without seeming to make interest. And unfortunately, the merchants in Abbasid Empire were very, very clever at things like this. You could You could carry out a transaction in Baghdad and make sure goods were paid for in Cordoba very, very easily in that period. I mean, very, very highly sophisticated. You also had very sophisticated banking systems in ancient China, ancient India, and so forth. So where did capitalism come from? I want to go back. You see, someone sort of implied with a peculiar form of social relations, and there has to be some explanation of this peculiar form. It's not that peculiar. I think really, if you say, how do you exploit people's labour, as opposed to through interest and so forth, there's three ways you exploit people's labour. You can have them as slaves, you own them, you can have them as semi-slaves, as serfs, that is, you have half control over them, or you have this peculiar system, the system whereby they're apparently free, but because you control the means of production, in order for them to make a livelihood, they have to donate their labour to you. There's three basic forms. You may be able to say there's forms intermediate between the two. You may say there's forms of serfdom, like in Tsarist Russia, some form of serfdom with some elements of slavery in it, in the sense that the serfs were very, very highly controlled and were bought and sold. You may say there's forms of free labour which have elements of transition with serfdom and free labour. But there's only three basic forms. And what's interesting, the third form does not just arise in Western Europe. I mean, already in about 2,000 years ago, there's a Chinese treatise called the Treatise on the Trade in Iron and Salt. Treatise on Iron and Salt, which goes through the discussion all the problems of using slave labour in industrial production. And the arguments are the same as those you'd find in Adam Smith. Adam Smith produced this book in 1776. You're going back 1,800 years previously, and the discussion is slaves are not committed to what they're doing, therefore they ruin the tools they're working on, therefore they don't work seriously. The implication being you want to have you want free labour, people who work for themselves or seem to work for themselves. They've got to be more committed, productive process, more productive, and so forth. And that raises the question: at some point in history, does it become more profitable to allow people to seem to be free, working free? And you take the money, and you get this weird profit which comes from them working for you as free workers, and you are able to charge them for working for you. That's effectively what capitalism consists of. Or do you use slave labour? And at some points, there's a whole transitory period in which these discussions take place. They take place in China, in China 2,000 years ago. They take place in Sung China just over 1,000 years ago. They take place in the writings of Adam Smith. They take place in the United States at the time of the Civil War. Long discussions about is slavery more productive or less productive than free labour. And the logic of free labour, and you have to say free labour at some points breaks through. And it tends to break through, in my view, when the force of production reaches a certain point. If you like, the calculation is this: if you control someone, you can take as much of their labour as you can before they starve. If they starve, you're wiping out an asset. So you treat them like you might a cow. You feed the cow as little as possible in order to get the milk. You have a slave. You feed the slave as little as possible in order to get as much labour as possible from him or her. But then, as the calculation becomes, actually, the slave has some things a cow doesn't. The slave can commit themselves, has initiative, can work harder. Perhaps if we were to take slightly less proportion of the labour, the worker then will produce much more goods, and a smaller proportion of more goods, then that's a bigger cake. And that's the logic, the whole argument. And it's the argument there, not merely in the rise of capitalism, in the argument there, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, in the argument between slavery and serfdom. Serfdom is more efficient as a means of engaging in certain sorts of productive agricultural technology of the late first millennium. Serfdom is more productive than direct slavery, and you find therefore the collapse of the Roman Empire that move over towards forms of serfdom, the collapse of the Carolingian Empire 1100 years ago across northern Europe, the move from attempts at slavery to this semi-free situation of serfdom. It corresponds to what's needed for a ruling class to get the best out of the means of production it controls. And you have to understand the move towards capitalism in this sense becomes possible at a certain point in history. That's my argument. Now, why did it happen were the force of production that backward in 14th, 15th century Europe, 14th century Britain? Actually, they weren't backward compared with what we have today. They were infinitely more advanced than they were in 9th and 10th century Europe. I mean, the argument I have in my book, and I don't have time to go into it, is the real development of the force of production takes place the other side of Eurasia, in China and the Islamic empires and so forth. Over a period of hundreds of years, these techniques infiltrate through to Western Europe, transform particularly agriculture and creation of mills and so forth, and some industrial techniques in Western Europe, particularly. And in Western Europe, because the old superstructure is less heavy, they're able to flower more quickly. There's less waste and less loss in Western Europe. That's the argument I would put forward. And those situations, then you find, just as you did in Song China 1,000 years ago, you find in Western Europe in the 14th, 15th, in the 13th, 14th, 15th century, various forms of free labour or transitional forms towards free labour. I don't have time to talk about now where the form, for instance, where the merchant advances the worker, advances the weaver, that's the materials the weaver needs. The merchant may actually provide the weaver with the loom the weaver is working on, and in return the weaver gives some of his products to the merchant. It's a sort of half form between towards free labour. But you find this developing all across Western Europe in this period. And it's not new to Western Europe, you found it developing other places in previous periods. And this represents a trend towards the development of capitalism which is taking place in Western Europe, and taking place elsewhere. You find exactly the same forms developing across northern India in the period. And and you find the same forms developing to various degrees in Ming China, which is the Ming China, our period of the 16th, 17th century. You find these forms developing here, and what I would say is the difference is, for various reasons, it's to do with various reasons. The superstructure is more powerful at certain points in history in China and in northern India and in the medieval Islamic world than it is in parts of Western Europe. And in those parts of Western Europe, therefore, huge struggles take place, and the old superstructure is smashed. And people talk about the Dutch Revolt. It's fantastically important. The old superstructure was not smashed in northern Italy. It was not smashed in the southern Netherlands, which in the early 16th century were more advanced than the northern Netherlands. It was not smashed in Bohemia, which is another advanced area. Transylvania, of all places, quite advanced. If you go there, it's obviously quite advanced in the 15th, 16th century. The old superstructure was not smashed there. It was smashed in certain places, and that required mobilisation, organisation, revolutionary parties, I don't know what you'd call the capitalist version of Marxism, but it did require a fantastic ideological struggle where right across Europe people were breaking with Catholicism, trying to interpret the world in new ways, in diverse ways, and so forth. All that was required. And that, for us, is important because, what I'd say is the reason I go back to it, you see, I think the reason why Brenner dismissed the talk about the force of production is, of course, there used to be a very, very crude version of Marxism. If you read a book by a man called Stalin called Dialectical and Historical Materialism, it's all about the forces of production automatically lead to changes in relation to production. And it's a very simple argument, because he was using slave labour to develop industry and child labour to develop industry in Russia. You have to give the impression, however barbaric the means we do, automatically this will produce a wonderful socialist society. I mean, people like Brenner react against that, but they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They throw out the central insight of Marx, that society, that over thousands of years of history, human beings changed their ways of making a livelihood. A whole period of this change in the ways of livelihood produces class societies. Class societies then defend themselves in superstructure, and society cannot proceed further unless you smash the superstructure. But it's not just a question of smashing the superstructure without understanding the forces which are produced by the changes in people's livelihoods and so forth. I think this is the essential argument. And I think the trouble with Brenner as he throws it out, I could talk at length about this, this is this weird thing with Brenner that his volume, The Brenner Debate, which is all about small, micro changes in relations in the English countryside. And then his later studies on Merchants of the Revolution is about the English Revolution of the 1640s. And there's no connection between the two. You know, he deals with two episodes in the development of capitalism. He doesn't see what the connection between the two is. He doesn't see the role of the towns in leading the countryside in the assaults upon feudalism. He doesn't see the relationship between the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment in bringing about this change. And I think it's an unnecessary. It's a break with the Marxist method. And I say this about Brenner because he's a revolutionary socialist. He's absolutely committed to struggle against George Bush and against Kerry and every other vermin in the world. But in the process, he's dropped these key elements of Marxism, and I think it's a pity. This is, and I should say we have to rediscover them, because if we want to have understanding what we're at this point in history, we need to have some understanding of the past.